everyone, my name is Journey Harris. I'm a 2021 Equitable Public Space Fellow at Design Trust for Public Space, and I am gathered here with my lovely panelists who are so patient, and this is Public Sanctuaries, a case for redefining the Black church as public space. So before we go into introductions and the conversation that I want to have today, I'd like to share a little bit about the genesis of this project. So my research on the Black church and public space was inspired by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his book, Strength to Love. In one of his sermons, he calls for the church to actively participate in the struggle for peace and justice. I believe redefining the church as public space is a way to return to that great historic mission. So I'm here with my co-moderator, Reverend Sue Harris Green, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, Thank you, Journey, for inviting me. I am Reverend Sue Harris Green, and I am Journey Harris's grandmother. And it's exciting to see her be the boss, and I'm not now. So I am a graduate of Wesley Theological Seminary with a master's of divinity degree and also concentration in urban ministry. I worked with the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development for about 41 years, and I worked 35 years in housing, multifamily housing, single-family housing, group home, and elderly housing, as well as, just housing period, and in rural America. I'm also an associate minister at New Bethel Church here in Washington, D.C. And another thing is that I have a radio show that comes on pretty much every Sunday, in Urban One Radio. And please tune in. We discuss several items and topics. Whatever you think about, that's what we have. So it's nice to be here again, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I'm also joined by Reverend Derek McQueen, who is the pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church, which is where we are right now, this beautiful sanctuary. Thank you so much for hosting us and having us here. We're also joined by Jason LeBate. Here's to my left. Jason is an attorney focusing on faith-based development, not-for-profit law, affordable housing, and community development, and he serves as the chair of Bricks and Mortals. And we have Reverend Bridget Kelso over here to my left, who's a minister of engagement at West End Church and a lecturer at the City College of New York. Thank y'all for being here. For those who were tuned into the live earlier, we had some sound difficulties, so we're changing up the program. We're here and having conversation. If you'd like to leave any questions in the comments, we can maybe address that at another time, but this is our conversation. It's recorded and will be uploaded for people to watch later. And I'm really, really excited about what we're gonna talk about today. Before we get into definitions of the Black church and public space, I'd like to share a little bit more about our sponsors of today's event. So we're sponsored by the Design Trust for Public Space and Bricks and Mortals. The Design Trust is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the future of public space in New York City. Their projects bring together city agencies, community groups, and private sector experts to make a lasting impact through design on how New Yorkers live, work, and play. Bricks and Mortals is our co-sponsor of today's event, and they're a grassroots membership-driven organization comprised of individuals, organizations from faith-based institutions, and the real estate community. They empower faith-based organizations by impartially providing connections to resources, connections, trainings, to maximize and monetize their real property, to support mission, benefit the community, and continue their good work. So thank you to Bricks and Mortals, thank you to Design Trust for your help with this event. And so let's start off with some definitions. Since we're talking about redefining the Black church, I think it's important to define what the Black church is and what public space is, as we'll be talking about it in today's conversation. So the Black church, as we're talking about it today, is a historically Black churches with predominantly Black congregations. It is both the people and the historical space. Public space, I love this definition that I found. It's a place that is generally open and accessible to people. They shape community ties and neighborhoods. They are places of encounter. They can facilitate political mobilization. They stimulate actions and help prevent crime. They are environments for interaction and exchange of ideas that impact the quality of urban environment. So those are our definitions. Let's just go ahead and start with some of the questions that Reverend Sue and I have for today.
Okay, Jason, since the pandemic, churches have had to find innovative ways to to serve people. I mean, really, really, really innovatively to serve people. And so what are some ways you have seen churches utilize public spaces, such as sidewalks, or you talk about parks, or basketball, baseball, to connect with the neighborhood? Mm-hmm. And also we will have Reverend Derek as well as Reverend Bridget to answer the question.
So maybe I'm the best to start because I think I'll have the worst answer. To be honest, what I saw with a lot of congregations, I mean, obviously there was a lot of movement into the online space, which I guess as an aside is interesting. I think it made worship more public. More people were able to attend, and then the recording, they're more able to, I know myself personally, sort of expand to additional churches. But what we've seen is it sort of really depended on what sort of church you were. So we've seen the denominations that have property, which may be a large conversation that we're going to have property expanded sort of not necessarily publicly, but into the outdoor or the more open spaces of their own property. So we represent Episcopal churches, and we saw a lot of movement onto the fields outside of their churches for worship, as well as the missional work that they do, their food pantries and those sorts of things. We saw other congregations that have smaller spaces that may not have historically owned property, that might be in smaller storefront churches and the like, see them expand into more public spaces to have the space and the distance required to maintain safety.
Well, I found it to be quite a stimulating exercise, because I do believe that what ended up happening is that folks actually realized that the church is not the sanctuary, that the church is the community. So we've been able to spearhead here in St. James a whole new ministry of just doing outreach and being outreach partners. We have 2 new schools on this block, and so we've really reached out to them to let them know that we are their partners. The newest school had their graduation here. We're their emergency site. The kids, I was with them with their rehearsals. We have a basketball league that is in the park every year, has been for over 20 years, and we're now a partner with them. We had a team this year. We did some grieving with them for someone who was lost, who was shot from gun violence here at 146th Street. We remembered him on the basketball court with the entire community. So just being present with the community has been the ministry impact that I've been focusing people on the language of what is the ministry impact of this church being here. It doesn't have so much to do with what happens in here, but it has to do with the fact that there is a place that people see and identify as a space that they can go to that is accessible to them, that they know that if and when they need, or even if they just want to walk in and sit for a couple of moments, the place is here. And that's been a big shift for organized churches here in Harlem, at least for this particular congregation.
One of the most profound things one of our members said when we first went online, we went fully online Zoom worship services on Sunday morning. She said, "We will not make an idol of our building." Mm-hmm. And we were like, oh, okay, that's interesting. It also sort of, us going online also sort of really opened up our definition. We always think of, the marginalized, the oppressed, and the people who've been left out. We think of the poor, or we think of people of color, or people who are incarcerated. But what we had also done was we had marginalized disabled people who couldn't make it into these spaces. Being on Zoom now said, people who have mobility issues can join us for worship. They had been begging us for that for years, and we had not been able to do it. We had chosen not to do it. So the Zoom space is not going away. It should not go away. The church must stay accessible. The Zoom space is part of the public space of the church now. It must be respected as such. It must be fully considered. It was the life of our church. It was how we stayed together over 2 full years. we had more people coming to our worship services on Zoom than we did in person.
I have a follow-up. Am I allowed to? We're
Yeah,
encouraging
please,
discussion.
yeah.
So I'm interested in the play, I think, between the virtual and the in-person, the physical. And as you were saying, Reverend Derek, like you're physically going to the community, and that it works in both directions. It works in both directions. That the church is not the building, but I heard you say at the end of that, the building is a resource for the church. I guess it's a two-part question. One, so is the outreach making greater use and making more public the building, and because you're doing physical outreach, and then the virtual, has there been any interaction? Because that's also sort of a public effort, even if it is worship. Has that sort of made the space more public or different, the physical space?
You know, Jason, what I've done is I've put a focus on the idea that our churches in our communities mean more than just the building. It's a sensibility of spirituality, and they're touchstones of spirituality and community. So that even when you're driving, like at 147th Street here on St. Nicholas Avenue, you can see the spire for this church. And no matter what happens with development in this neighborhood, my goal is to make sure that that spire can be seen. Not so that St. James can be seen, but so that people know that there is a touchstone of spirituality in the community. That's what I mean by that as well. And for the Zoom, I also want to put a plug in for our seniors. I always make sure there's a phone number that they can connect to. Because many people will say, I just want to do Zoom, I don't want to do the phone number. But everybody knows how to use a phone. And that has been a saving grace for many of our people who have actually moved. The ministry has had the families and seniors be able to move home, leave New York City, being elderly citizens, home alone, and just at the will of the community and at the will of the world. Their families have taken them in and moved them to places down south, and they're still able to be a part of their community.
Wow.
It's been beautiful.
And I'm not saying that the building isn't important. I think it made us think differently about our building. We did see it as, we became multi-campus in a way that we wouldn't have thought about, I don't think, in another way. Like it was like, this is one campus, this actual space, and then there's the other virtual space as well. And how do we make sure that those two spaces interact and are given equal importance, are given equal attention? One thing that we did was we always made sure there was always one minister online who was at home, so that everyone sort of saw that there was someone at home who was with them in a ministerial capacity, and then there was somebody in person as well in the space.
That's so considerate. I think that this time has definitely made churches more considerate, and we've had conversations about church people need to be more public people. It's not just about the space, but also the attitude and the delivery of how we share resources within the church. And so if I were to ask or answer the question that you had just posed, I would think about there was a church next to my building when I lived in Crown Heights not too long ago, and every Thursday they'd have food on the sidewalk, and they would give out rice, they'd give out bread, they'd give out fresh produce, and it reminded me of the work of the Black Panther Party and how the free breakfast for children program that started in the Episcopal Church. And then going back even further, 1777, the first African church, Baptist church, they used that space as a sanctuary for runaway slaves, and they would hide underneath the floorboards. And so just thinking about the past and thinking about the present, I think Black churches have historically been public spaces. And I think my generation, I am Gen Z, I think my generation doesn't have that same kind of respect or understanding for the church, because there has been some tension. There's been tension, there's been changes, people have experienced hurt. And so the question that I have for Reverend Bridget and for Reverend Derek is, what can historically Black churches do to heal these relationships with the community around them and kind of reclaim that historical role as an unofficial public space?
I feel very strongly, again, I'm going to say it again, we've got to be clear about who we mean when we say marginalized. We cannot continue to other and ostracize our queer, trans siblings. We must do better in the Black church. And there's a lot that goes into all of that, but we cannot be whole without all of our siblings with us. Our trans and our queer siblings bring so much. They are the future of the church. We cannot continue on without them. So we've got to be really clear about making sure that when we say marginalized, that is what we have done. We've marginalized our queer siblings. And they must be brought back into the fold. We must make space for them.
And for those who may not understand, what is the harm in marginalization? Like, let's be like explicit, because I think it's interesting.
All the thousand cuts that we do in the Black church. Hate the sin, but love the sinner. This idea that that someone's identity can be separated or demonized, but then you also still love them. No, this is who people are. God, we can't be fully believers in the fact that we are made in the image of God, and then say, actually, just some people are made in the image of God, we're not like that, not like this, but not like that. We've got to be fully aware of of the harm that we do. Most of the people that I minister to are people who are coming from other spaces where they have been beaten down by Scripture and by ministers and people in the pulpit. The pulpit has been used against people in really terrible ways. That was one of the reasons why I felt I was called to ministry, was to be an ally and an advocate for my queer siblings. So,
thank you. Reverend Derek, how would you respond to that question?
You know, it was very interesting when I believe that understanding the history of our congregations and the history period is really important. When you talked about that church that was an abolitionist church, our mother church here at St. James Shiloh was an abolitionist church here in New York City 200 years ago, when First Presbyterian Church, the denominational lead in the church, still had slaveholding pastors. So that's a powerful statement. So how do we look at where we are 200 years later? And so the idea is, where is abolition needed? Where is liberation needed? Because if Christ is about liberation and we're about liberation, then we want to explore that together. And we are welcome to explore our liberation together. And of course that expands beautifully to the LGBTQ space. I'm the first out African American pastor in the Presbyterian Church here in Harlem and in New York City. And so for me to be here and to lead a congregation and say, but your oppression and your ability to say that you need to be liberated is just as important as my freedom is. You know, that brings us to a level of, now we're trying to understand where we are and where we are and how we lift that up. And you start to look at the world through a lens of saying, none of this is right. We have to bring one another. We have to free one another, because in order to free ourselves as community allows us to walk with God and build a relationship with God in an even more streamlined sense. And it's so beautiful that way. But we start with saying, where are we being oppressed, and where do we need to be liberated?
And we can do it. We can be creative. The Black church came out of hush harbors and secret spaces and behind the shack and behind the barn and in the glen and under the bushel. Like we've always been creative and found spaces and found ways to make sure that people are brought in. The church can do it. We can. We can be creative.
That's encouraging. Thank you.
Okay. The Black churches have owned the building, the property, the land for many years. Although we still see Black churches that have closed the doors before the pandemic, and especially during those 2 years, and still now closed the doors. It closed the doors, which means they lost their land, they lost their building, and some did not know where they were going after their doors were closed. Some of the children in the community did not have a place to go. So for Black churches that own their building, how does that property translate to power? What does this asset mean for the communities that surround the church? Jason.
Let's start with Jason, yeah.
All right, I guess I'll give the legal answer, and then the pastors can take us to church. So to lay it out there, I guess from a legal, from a real estate market perspective, right? I think it's probably not news to anybody that what were once communities that had sort of been abandoned and or disinvested in, that got a lot of investment from African American community, have now are gentrifying, right? And so what you're seeing is, or what we see a lot, Harlem being an example, Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, really everywhere in Brooklyn, increasingly in the Bronx and other dense urban areas, is you're seeing two things happen. You're seeing the physical plant of the church deteriorate. I think frequently simultaneous with the congregations dwindling, for many reasons, in part because of disbursement of congregations. And you're seeing real estate markets rise. And that leads to a sort of a number of things that we've seen. There's sort of denial on in many congregations saying, no, it's the answer's right around the corner, and they have faith as they should, but many fail to plan. And simultaneously, we've seen a lot of developers, there's one in the news today, prey upon vulnerable congregations. The third element that I didn't think about till now is you also have a community that has either, or frequently, has forgotten about or taken for granted their faith-based institutions, and they are not quasi-public anymore, for whatever the reason is, whether it's the community's fault, the congregation's fault, nobody's fault, everyone's fault. Because in Harlem, what we've seen is a number of churches come extinct, sell their property, and become luxury condominiums, furthering gentrification, sort of eliminating public or quasi-public space, further eliminating community. And we saw people in the community, or I've been in meetings where people in the community simultaneously would say, I can't believe that they didn't come to us before they sold and turned into luxury developers. And I said, did you knock on their door? Like, how many times did you talk to them? It's a two-way street. So anyway, this is what we're seeing a lot of. To answer your question, it is power. Place is power in the community. And sometimes, again, there's this tension because you don't want to idolize the building or the place, because church can be anywhere with anyone without anything. But the ability to have, exactly as you're saying, this quasi-public space where you can be a resource for the community, that simultaneously has power. And so it isn't universal that, yes, the church or the faith-based organization must remain in that space. That's clearly not the answer. But the answer is the congregation and the community need to be in a place to make an informed decision as to what to do with that building and that place. And so that's the bottom line of what I was going to say, is there needs to be planning ahead of time. What we've seen is unplanned, sort of emergent destruction of and loss of congregations in Harlem and other areas, where it is resulting, because it is unplanned, I think, in deterioration of the community.
Derek, did you want to add anything to that question about power?
Well, Jason, I'm with you 100% with that, because there's a, I would say, a translation issue in understanding the idea of real estate power, and the idea of the real estate power that we have here on this corner at 141st Street and St. Nicholas Avenue is very palpable. But the community real estate is even more palpable. So being able to be conversant in both of those spaces and in all of those spaces, is not even a binary, is very, very, very important. Like, for example, today, we were just the recipient of a $32,000 grant, so we're having an architectural assessment doing to say, what do we need to do to restore this building? I can go out and say to any organization, I want money, I want money, I want money, but if I can't tell you what it is I need done with an architectural assessment by an historical landmark architect, then it's blowing in the wind. It's not really being able to speak to that. But the important part behind that is not just restoring the building, but it's keeping the legacy alive for the next generation and the generation after that. I also include this real estate wealth as generational wealth for our African American communities, where that phrase is just starting to pick up and just starting to get some traction. And I think churches can lead the way if we recognize that our buildings and our communities are generational wealth. And we can model that for our communities. I'm a staunch advocate of that. So.
I love that. I want to revisit that definition of public space. There was a piece of that definition that says public spaces are an environment of interaction. And so that makes me assume that public spaces are also a container of tension, because there's interaction coming from all sides. So in redefining the Black church as a public space, how can the church serve as a buffer between community with deep ties to a neighborhood and developers whose work may be gentrifying the space around them? What can the church do? I mean, you all have given great examples, but just thinking about the church's role as an unofficial public space and a possible buffer between the tensions that are happening in neighborhoods around these Black churches.
I think churches can't be afraid of the social justice and sort of the political aspect of the work that we need to do. There's so much anxiety about, separation of church and state, and we can't endorse. There's a big gap between endorsing somebody for mayor or president and saying this particular policy is harmful to people of color. This particular law that was just passed is harmful to women who find themselves pregnant or find themselves having an ectopic pregnancy and need abortion care. There's a big gap between that. We cannot be afraid, as followers of Jesus, who was incredibly political, who was killed because of his politics. We cannot, as a church, then say, well, I don't want to bring politics in. The people in the community need to have a space, need to know that the harm that's happening in the world, the frustration that they feel on the street is addressed in the church. It doesn't make any sense to be out on the street and have harm being done and then come in to a space and then not hear it addressed. Or be told that this is not the space for it.
I want to, build off that. You hit something, I think, right on. So one of the things Bricks and Mortals has, is trying to make in common vernacular, and its Partners for Sacred Places in Pennsylvania created, is this HALO study. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it is the value that a faith-based organization brings to the community. And it's in offsetting social services, in the economic, the business development related to it, that it brings sort of the value to the community. But I say that, one, to remind everybody and maybe this group doesn't need reminding of the value of the church, but just to say that it can be in the languages, one is economic, is to say, look, in this language you need to be able to speak in it, and there is value. But the reason I bring that up is to say, frequently churches are thought of as, or do, provide the services that a community needs. And so the tension that you're talking about, sort of the gentrification, is creating homelessness. It's making housing unaffordable. And so I think a lot of what's happening, and that we see in some of my business, and that my firm does, and it's needed, is the creation of affordable housing and the creation of transitional and short-term housing. And faith-based organizations have a big role to play in that. But that's the service provision. To your point, you got to be out there making the policy, saying every development that goes up here, right, whatever the answer is, every development has to include affordable housing. The rent regulation or laws, and some of my clients hopefully won't see this video, the rent regulations need to be stronger to make sure that people can afford the apartments that they have and they can't be pushed out. So those are the sorts of things, I think, to your point, where you can say, look, we need, and it's not binary. It's not no, we absolutely want no development, because that can also be the death knell for a community. But I think too frequently we think of churches, or many people think of churches as service providers, and don't think of them as the sort of the radicals and the advocates sort of out there making the change that they need to see. And so I think that's critically important.
And I think that there's a spiritual dimension to it, because I'm also, gentrification becomes this hard term, because gentrification is equal to erasure. It's erasure of history, it's erasure of footprint, it's erasure of identity, culture. And we give that up too easily, because we say, well, gentrification is happening. St. James is in a gentrified neighborhood, but the history of this 127-year-old congregation that started an Ethiopian federation that worked with supporting schools for African Americans down in with the Lucy Trainee Craft, school system down south. The work that was done with abolition here with our mother church. All of those stories have to be spoken, have to be claimed, have to be held on to as part of the identity that can never be erased. And that pride that you have when you understand that this is where you're staying and this is how you can never be erased takes away, it allows the church to be able to sort of speak to those policies, to understand that your identity is built up in this, to be able to say, I'm going to sort of stick my neck out because this is what we're fighting for. It's not just land, it's also identity, it's culture, it's history, it's everything that was brought forward by what we've done as a community. And once again, I go back to the kids. Our children need to see this efficacy happening now in front of them so that they can model it as they grow older.
Well, yes, I would like to say something as far as housing is concerned. There are groups that we probably run into on a yearly basis almost, where they would tell you that churches should not be in the housing business. Literally, I've spoken that. Churches should not be in the housing business. So we have to just overcome that, because as working with developers and looking at church and working with churches in the past, nonprofit organization, we can own buildings. We are developers. We provide housing for our members. We provide housing for our elders. We have to understand that we are very capable of doing that. And so not to forget that, and educate our young people. Yes, this church owns that 100 unit down the street. Yeah, own it. This church owns that community building there, or that community facility, that health center is owned by the church in cooperation with the developer, in cooperation with the medical field, the doctors and other hospitals. The church owns it. And I think we need to hear that more and more and more. It's good to come to church. All of us are ministers. He's close to one, because lawyers always make the best grades in seminary. Why is that? That's another subject. But anyway, we have to educate our people, our children, our young adults about ownership. Ownership. Yes, we come. Yes, we pray. But God, I believe God is telling us that, yes, you own the housing complex down there. And let the people within the community know that, oh, that's owned by my church. Oh, that's owned. Oh, yes, I know that church. I know St. John. Yes, they own that complex down there. Why not? Why not?
On that note, I think that's interesting. You are speaking to churches' role as developers themselves. And I think it's good to be honest also about the capacity of many churches. Do they have the staff? Do they have the resources to be able to do that? Thanks to bricks and mortars, more churches are getting connected with the resources so that they can make use of their space. But I did want to just close up with one last question that kind of leans into that a little bit. But what is one thing you believe developers, urban planners, and others who work in the public space field and sector, what should they know about the Black church? It's a large question because there's a lot to know.
As was just being spoken about the facility of the Black church, and knowing our constituents and knowing our congregation members / constituents, talking about that translation, and knowing what is needed for our communities. That's being in that conversational pool. Very good. Get your urban planning models for the next 50 years. Now bring that conversation into conversation with the communities. We are the communities. We have the voices that we can bring together. We at least have the space if you want to do a forum to talk about what can happen. You know, if we were to really, I don't want to see another stick in the middle of the city here, another stick next to a park that's at 110th Street and, by Central Park. Who wants another stick that's up in the sky? We all know that it's the communities do better when communities are able to reach one another and see one another and gravitate toward one another. We're moving towards the spaces where we want to go up high and we want to go up insular. And our communities are about coming together and being family. Part of the reason why I love the work that I also do some work at Columbia University, and some of the work that I do there is sort of like I see a constituent of African American students who don't have aunties, who don't have uncles, who don't have grandmamas with them here in New York City. So I reach out to community members and say, look, they need some grandmamas. They need some aunties and some uncles. They don't need to be isolated in Ivy League because that's the way that the system says you have to be isolated, and you go off and you do your own and you get your own. It's vertical.
Yeah.
It's not. It's out like this. And I think that if developers were to be able to be in conversation at the minimum about what community is and how we're talking about community in Black church, they would learn an awful lot about how to have more productive and community effusive building and development of communities and redevelopment of communities, rather than having a model that they want to make up that they've learned in some classroom that says, well, this seems to be the most efficient and the most economical, and the place where we can make the most money. And the most effective that way. But I think that there's another way of dealing with the efficiency of it when you're in conversation with community.
I grew up in Chicago, and I grew up on the South Side, which is frankly the only side to be and one of the things that I always felt was that people, like violence in the community occurs when people don't feel like there's any investment. Like, I don't have any skin in the game. I have no ownership here.
Yes.
And especially when they see the disparity of their neighborhood and then across the street, like with Cabrini Green, it was like across the street from like luxury high rises. So when people see that disparity and they feel like they don't have any skin in the game or any ownership or any say-so about the space that they live in, then people act out, right? There's lots of reasons, obviously, for violence in various communities, but I feel like, getting to your question, people need to feel like they have a sense of ownership, that they have some say-so about the space that they live in. I go back to Chicago and I see the building that my grandmother grew up in, and it is gorgeous. It's been redone. My grandmother deserved to live in a beautiful building like that, and she did not. She lived in it was not dilapidated, but it had vacant lots on either side. It was not a well-developed neighborhood, and it is stunning now. My grandmother deserved that. So I like the idea of developers and people coming into, especially spaces where Black people are, who are already feeling some sort of way about how we're incorporated into life and all the daily aggressions and aggravations and daily assaults of being Black on this soil, we need to feel invested in our communities, and we need to feel like people who are coming in hear us and are making our needs known, and are making are incorporating our needs.
A while back, I keep telling my age, a while back, social gerontologists from all over the country actually met with the American Institute of Architects to really teach them about the aging process. Because they're architects, they build, they draw, they know. We say, this is what it is. What colors are you going to use? What type of doorknobs you're going to have? How that door looks, what you're thinking about, what the ceiling looks like. We taught them. We through the what's the National Endowments for the Arts. It's a part of it. So I think the books are in archives now, but you can go back and look. We literally taught them about the aging process from social gerontology perspective. So what I'm saying this is say that we teach the developers.
Yes.
We go back and teach the real estate. We teach the lawyers that are going to be working with Black churches. They have to be taught that. Taught me different ways, so many different ways. But I think we have to be proactive in doing this, because it's not just when they come. It's not, we have to be proactive. And a lot of Black churches, oh my goodness, what can we do? And that they should have thought about 15 years ago, and it's almost too late now. So that would be a great start to teach.
It's a wonderful model that changed the entire outlook of this congregation about what could be done. City College, their architectural school, had a studio project that they included St. James in. And these 12 students for the entire year worked in this neighborhood, Harlem School of the Arts, St. Luke's up the hill, trying to find ways that churches could stay in their ministry, but they could create these other opportunities, economic and community opportunities through their architectural studios. And these students came up with these plans that were just out of sight. I mean, there were 9 plans that were done in and around St. James, all different, all incredibly to open up and to be in conversation with the community and say, well, what about aging out housing for young people? And what about if we hooked them up with the artists that are working at Harlem School of the Arts, and we had them on a rooftop garden so that there would be an opportunity for those young people and those artists to talk about what is creative ways of making a life and building yourself as you're aging out of the process. And this is how they were thinking. And it was just sort of awesome to really see that youth who have the opportunity to, in their learning process, to engage in this, while going to the city planners and saying, well, can we get the permits for this? How's this? They have to do that work too. It was just absolutely incredible. And it opened up the minds of this congregation to be able to see their church be a church, but to be revitalized as some sort of a community outreach or community a resource. Yeah. So I think that education that you're talking about is a key that is so often overlooked. And it was free for us.
But that can't happen if we're like, well, we've always done it like this. And that's not our tradition. And I don't know about that. Black churches are notorious for holding on to tradition until it is on its last gasp. Until it's like throttled. We have to, we can be creative. I have a lot of hope for the Black church. Yeah. So it can be done.
Yeah. Jason, did you want to add to something you think that developers should know about?
I'm not sure they can, but that has never stopped me before. So I have a short answer and then a slightly longer answer. The short answer is this should be required viewing for every developer considering working with a Black church. 100%, no question. And so in that vein, all I'm going to do is sort of summarize, I think, part of this discussion. I think what they need to, you said something, Reverend Derek, that just keeps echoing for me, is generational wealth. They should be, a developer should be thinking generational wealth. And what I love about that term, at least for me, when I think about it, it expands in every direction. It is economic and it is community. It is history and it is the assets that you've accumulated, and it's the not just monetary and real assets, but the talents, the abilities, the history is an asset, and then and how you're going to develop those assets and grow them going forward. That's exactly what a developer should be.
And thank you for mentioning generational wealth, because I feel like that speaks to my own personal story with churches. I got my first job through a church. I started a babysitting company because I worked in children's ministry. I got to learn about parks. I got to learn about ministry. I got to learn so much from within my church, and I felt as a young person, as a child, I was considered, I was taken care of. I had family members at the church because I lived in a city where I didn't have a lot of family. It was me, my mom, my grandpa, and the church. That was my family. So I've always seen the church as this resource, and it's really special to be with you all today and see that you all see it as a resource as well. And I do think this should be required viewing for developers. So we'll definitely make sure this is archived well so that people can learn from this conversation. And thank you all so much for being here. Before we close out, I did want to just go around, and if there's anything you wanted to share about what you're working on, services that people should know about, this would be a really great time to plug that. So let's start from the left and we'll go to the right.
Well, this coming Sunday is my last Sunday at the West End Collegiate Church. I'm a full-time lecturer now at City College, and I'm going to be doing something called sci-fi sermons on TikTok.
Oh, wow.
So look for that, where I sort of talk about, I love Star Trek, Star Wars, The Sandman, all of the new stuff that's come out. And I want to sort of tease out like the little, the spiritual lessons or the things that sort of resonate with me. So that's coming out.
All right.
So look for that.
Very good.
Sci-fi sermons. Okay.
Love it.
Very good. Well, we're here at St. James every Sunday. We're online, and we're on Zoom, and we're on YouTube as well. The day after, I edit the services for that. And I'm just doing a lot of work with Bricks and Mortals. I'm doing their S4 sustainability program. I'm working with 10 churches in New York City to think about different ways of being sustainable. We're venturing out on what to do with this beautiful building, how to move that forward. And I'm also sort of speaking to your grandma, I'm sorry, to our facilitator, our moderator.
Oh, that's fine.
Earlier about some works that I do academically. I was trained at Union Theological Seminary in homiletics and New Testament. So one of my major projects is preaching and teaching through conversation with community.
Okay.
So looking at our Bible studies in community and how they interact with what happens on Sunday.
And what time is service?
11 a.m.
11 a.m.
11 a.m.
On Facebook Live, right? Okay.
And we're doing a special September 11th communion.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you. Grandma, Reverend
Oh,
Sue.
right. I don't know where to start. But I am also the leader of elderly ministry at our church in Bethel. And next week we're starting a Bible study, the book of Ruth. So somebody told me, they said, well, that's for women. I said, no. Ruth is community. Ruth is wealth. Ruth is family. Ruth is everything that we deal with every single day. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about the book of Ruth. So we just exciting to be creative in doing this Bible study about Ruth. So my mind is right there now, and I will continue to do our radio show. You're talking about voting and the importance of voting. Some people say, well, I don't vote. I said, that's because that's why you got that judge in your community now, and you can't get rid of the judge because you don't vote. So I'm doing that. I'm working in the community where I live. We do have serious gentrification, but I stay on our DCRA. I hope they're listening. DCRA about what they should be doing, what they should not be doing, to try to maintain our homes in our community and not building skyrise apartments right next door to you and stopping me from seeing the beautiful sun that comes out on the east side in the early morning. So those are things I'm doing, community work.
And Jason, what about you? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, I'm just going to keep it short. I think that we plugged it already, but hopefully if you are a faith-based organization and you have real property and you want to figure out how you can use it better and engage in conversations like this, you should go check out Bricks and Mortals. And they'll help steer you. So It's a worthwhile organization. So thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank
Jeremy.
you for being here. Thank you, all
Thank
of you.
you.
Thank you to Design Trust for Public Space once again. Thank you, Karen,
Thank
for
you,
being
Karen.
here, for your help. Thank you, Grandpa Mike, who's over there. Thank you again to Bricks and Mortals, and for everybody who watched the short 5-minute live or who's viewing this now. Thank you for watching. Developers, if y'all need any help, this is the resource right here. So yeah, that is all. This will be archived on YouTube, and thank you all for tuning in.